Okay, this is the last part of this chapter, and it kind of brings everything together. So we are looking at force of muscle contractions. It depends on how many muscle fibers are stimulated and the size, which we looked at in the last part. So the more motor units, the more action potential is stimulated, the greater the force, and then the bigger the muscle fibers, the greater the force. And as you use your muscles more, they're going to get bigger. Also, how frequent the stimulation is. So if you have a whole bunch of stimulations together, they're going to be added up together. And how much of the sarcomeres are being shortened. So are they being shortened a little bit or by a lot? So frequency of stimulation, which we looked at before, the number, how big they are, and how much shortening is happening. Those are the things that are going to influence your muscle contraction. Okay, so if your sarcomeres are really stretched out, you're not going to have much tension. If they're squished together and shortened more, you're going to have more tension, but there's a limit. If they start to overlap, then you're not going to have, like, notice how the Z lines or the actin filaments are overlapping, you're going to have less tension there. Okay, and then how fast it contracts and how long is influenced by muscle fiber type, load, and recruitment. So muscle fiber type, there are two different types of muscle fibers, slow and fast, and different people have different numbers and different proportions of them. Slow twitch muscles have more endurance and they contract more slowly, and then fast twitch muscles have more power, but they contract more quickly. And then you have the metabolic pathways. There are fibers that are better at using aerobic pathways, which are the slower ones, and then there are fibers that are better at glycolytic, which are anaerobic, which are like the lactic acid pathway. So you can have slow oxidative fibers, or you can have fast oxidative fibers or fast glycolytic fibers. And it just depends on the person's genetic. And you can have a mix of them too. So slow oxidative fibers, you are using them to sit in your chair. They are for endurance activities like marathon runners, maybe. And then fast oxidative are medium intensity, and then fast glycolytic are the short-term ones, which makes sense. Like that fits with what we learned in the last part. So, so you're looking at contractile velocity and contractile duration, and then it depends on what type of fibers you have. So the ones that are slow oxidative are more fatigue resistance. You can use them longer, but not as intense. And then the fast glycolytic muscles fatigue really quickly, but they're more powerful. Okay, so here's a comparison of each of those. So you can use that to understand all three. Okay, so load and recruitment. If you have a greater load, you're going to have a shorter contraction and slower contraction. So the muscles are not going to be contracted as much because they're working so hard. And then the more muscle fibers or motor units that are recruited, you're going to have a faster and longer contraction with more muscle fibers. So a heavy load, it's not going to shorten as much, and it's going to be shorter, like shorter duration. And if you have a light load, like you're carrying an empty laundry basket, you're going to have a longer contraction, and it's going to be more shortened. And then if you increase the load, it's going to be slower as it gets heavier. Okay, so aerobic endurance, like jogging, swimming, biking, that's going to help you. That's going to make your muscles work better. So you're going to have more muscle capillaries. You're going to make more mitochondria. Your muscles have hundreds of mitochondria, but you're going to make more if you use them. So that's going to allow you to provide more ATP. And then you're also going to make more myoglobin. So that'll be more strength, more resistance to fatigue, greater endurance. You can also, your fibers can change. So you can go from glycolytic to more oxidative. If you do resistance exercise like weightlifting or isometric exercises that we talked about last time, where you're not changing the length of your muscles, that can cause your fibers to increase, making you stronger. It also increases mitochondria, myofilaments, glycogen stores, connective tissue. So both of them are going to increase your muscle just in different ways. So you have to use your muscles to remain healthy. If you don't, it's called atrophy. You might have heard of that. If your muscles atrophy, your muscle strength can decline 5% per day. So people who are bedridden, who are not able to use their muscles, they experience this. And it's really hard to regain. So it's important that you keep active. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about smooth muscle, which we focused a ton on skeletal. So smooth muscle is found in your organs, in the walls. It moves stuff around your body. So it moves blood around, food around, waste around. So respiratory, digestive, urinary, reproductive, it moves babies out and around, and circulatory. It's in your blood vessels, except not in your heart. So your heart contains cardiac muscle, but it's in the blood vessels, right? You have two different kinds of, like smooth muscles run in two different directions. You have longitudinal and circular. Longitudinal run parallel along, like if you're looking at your veins, they're going to run parallel with your veins, and then circular are going to run perpendicular. So they run in two different directions, and they are spindle shaped as opposed to like the long cylinders. They're kind of like cirrus clouds, if you know what that is. They don't have a lot of the connective tissue that the other muscles have, so they only have endomysium, and they have one nucleus, no striations, which we learned. They have these varicosities, which are little swellings of nerve fibers, so they don't have the same like structures as skeletal muscles. They don't have the same like neuromuscular junction. It's more diffuse. It's autonomic. That's the automatic part of your nervous system, which means that it's involuntary. So see how they look kind of bulbous? They're called varicosities. They're just different looking, and they have a slightly different mechanism. So they have less elaborate SR. They don't have T-tubules. They do store, like the SR does store the calcium, but most of the calcium is from outside of the cell that comes in. They have these little caveolae, these little infoldings in the sarcolemma, and that's where they store, that's like where the calcium comes in and like floods the muscle fiber. So it looks a little different, this little cave, right? And then the calcium is going to flood in, and then here's your SR, and then that's going to cause the same mechanism. They have gap junctions also. So this is different because these and cardiac muscles respond differently to electrical stimuli because they're all kind of tied together. Skeletal muscles are each kind of on their own, each muscle fiber is on their own, but when smooth muscle gets zapped, there's gap junctions, and so it's going to cause a lot of fibers to get zapped at the same time, whereas skeletal muscles are like each on their own. Okay, so the other differences are you have fewer thick filaments, and you have myosin heads through the entire length instead of just on like that one area. So the ratio is 1:13 of thick to thin, and the thick filaments have the heads all along. And there's none of this troponin part. There is tropomyosin, but there's no troponin. So it has a different protein that does the calcium mechanism. So let's see. So here's like one single nucleus. It looks like a little worm. And these are your gap junctions that are going to connect different cells, like adjacent cells, and then these are the intermediate filaments. So it definitely looks different, and you can see the spindle shape too. And that these connect it to other cells so that one nerve impulse can cause a lot of them to contract. Okay, so thin and thick filaments are diagonal. They're not like stripes because they're not striated. They're diagonal, like a quilt, kind of spiraled. And then you have intermediate filaments too that create like a lattice. So it's kind of similar structures, but they are shaped differently. It kind of looks like a quilt. So that's what they look like when they contract. So definitely a different mechanism. Here's a comparison of the three. I think we've seen this before. And here we are again. So remember, smooth only has endomysium and cardiac too, and then skeletal has all three. The mechanism of contraction is pretty similar between skeletal and cardiac, but smooth is like an alien. It's like completely different. And then here you are showing the motor end plate, and then this is showing what it looks like on smooth muscles. So definitely a different look to it. And then here is the comparison of the sliding filament theory. So you can see cardiac and skeletal are similar, and then smooth is not. So it's a different mechanism there, and you don't have the tropomyosin. Okay, so mechanism of contraction in smooth muscle, it's slower, it's synchronized because you have those gap junctions, so the electrical impulse can like shock throughout lots of the cells. So the action potentials are transmitted. You don't need each muscle fiber to be zapped. So some cells are self-excitatory, so they can, without anything, they can contract on their own. So it is a different thing. So otherwise it's similar because it shortens. You still have the actin and myosin, still the sliding filament mechanism. You still have the calcium. The ATP is still a player. Contraction stops when there's no calcium. So all of those things are the same, but it does have some differences. So one of them is the calmodulin. You have this myosin kinase molecule. That causes the phosphorylation, and that causes the cross-bridging. Then you have relaxation. So that's because the calcium is detaching, and then you're going to have dephosphorylation with the ATP and all that. So here is the calcium rushing in, and it activates the calmodulin. And then that causes kinase to become active, and that causes the ATP to get used up, so it phosphorylates it, and then that causes the cross bridges. So it's a different mechanism, but there are some similarities. So smooth muscle is slower to contract and relax, but it can stay contracted for longer and doesn't get as tired. ATPases are slower. It saves energy. It's just kind of a slower muscle, like slower mechanism. They're always kind of contracting and they don't get fatigued, like I said. And then I told you about the nerves also. So those gap junctions help to cause a whole bunch of them to contract at once. Hormones also work on them. So some smooth muscle doesn't have nerves that stimulate it. It's just chemicals that can cause it to stimulate. So that's another difference. There are other special features. So it can respond to stretch. So there's a stress relaxation response. So it responds to stretch, and then it can kind of stay stretched out. So this is handy in your stomach when you like overeat. There's smooth muscle in there that can kind of stay stretched out for you. You might have a little discomfort, and then your bladder also can stay stretched out. And then there are length and tension differences. So it can contract when it is not at its resting length. Like, if that makes sense. Like normally, like skeletal muscle needs to start contracting when it's at its resting length, but it can contract when it's a different length. So your muscles can change volume and still stay like tense. Okay, so the smooth muscle varies in different organs by fiber and arrangement, organization, innervation, responsiveness to various stimuli. It can be unitary or multi-unit, so it's very adaptable to like your different body organs. So unitary is known as visceral muscle, found in lots of organs in your body. It is innervated by those little varicosities, those little nerve junctions. It has the longitudinal and circular sheets. Sometimes it'll get its own action potentials. And it can, like the electricity can jump through gap junctions and contract other fibers. and it responds to chemicals too. Multi-unit smooth muscle is in your large airways, large arteries, erector pili muscles, and the iris of your eye. So not as widespread. There are fewer gap junctions. They don't usually depolarize spontaneously. They're more similar to skeletal muscles than the unitary ones. More likely to be innervated by the autonomic nervous system and not do action potentials like on their own. Okay, all muscle tissue comes from embryonic myoblasts. So remember, blasts are the building cells, like oh my gosh, osteoblasts. So these are myoblasts, muscle building cells. So multinucleated skeletal muscles form from many myoblasts and they fuse together. Growth factor causes ACH receptors. So growth factor is going to make you make more ACH receptors so that you're more likely to contract your muscles. And then cardiac and smooth muscles, they don't fuse, they stay separate, but they develop gap junctions. And the baby's heart starts pumping when it's 3 weeks old. It's one of the first organs that starts like working right away in an embryo. So here are some like stem cells, mesoderm cells. They turn into myoblasts, then they fuse to make a skeletal fiber. So like this is part of one cell. We can regenerate muscle fiber, but the myoblasts, like skeletal muscle satellite cells, don't regenerate very well. Cardiomyocytes can regenerate a little better, but usually, like when you have a heart attack, usually your muscle tissue, your cardiac muscle that's destroyed, is replaced by connective tissue, and that's why heart attacks can be so damaging. And then smooth muscle can regenerate pretty well. Cardiac and skeletal muscle thickens in a child, and then when you get older, it can thicken even more. Okay, muscular development in infants. So you have to, when you're an infant and a kid, they need to use their muscles correctly so that the muscles and nerves develop correctly. So and it goes in a certain order too. So the baby can lift its head before it can walk. It starts out proximal and then it moves out to the distal parts of your body. Mid-adolescence is when you're at your peak in terms of neuromuscular control, when you're in athletics. Comparing muscles in sexes, female bodies like 36% muscle and male bodies like 42% because of testosterone. So testosterone works on muscles, it acts on muscles. But the body strength per unit muscle mass is the same. Aging muscles, when you get older, your muscle fibers decrease, you start to age, and so that's why they say that like regular exercise is really important. Weightlifting past 40 is really important. And that's it.